By the early 1960s, there were on average 4 hangings a year in Britain. How terrible is that? The last 2 executions were in August 1964. They were both men. The last woman to hang was Ruth Ellis, who'd shot her lover. She died in 1955. A bill to abolish the death penalty for murder came before the Commons in the Christmas of 1964. It was promoted by the Labour backbencher Sidney Silverman. As MPs debated in Parliament that night, Panorama staged its own discussion.
December the 21st. In 2.5 hours from now, we shall know whether or not hanging for murder is likely to be abolished in Great Britain. At this moment, the House of Commons is locked in debate on capital punishment. There'll be a free vote at 11 o'clock. Already, of course, the death sentence is limited to certain forms of murder and has been since the Homicide Act in 1957. 29 people have been executed since that act was passed, the last 2 on August the 13th of this year. 2 men lie under sentence of death at this moment, Ronald John Cooper, Peter Anthony Durnford. Now, as the debate goes on in the House, we present in the Panorama studio some of the arguments. Here, straight back from the House of Commons where he's been listening to the debate, Robin Day.
Well, first, before our discussion, I should report one significant new piece of testimony which gripped the entire House of Commons this evening. This came after the more predictable opening arguments. It came when the former Conservative Home Secretary, Mr. Henry Brooke, revealed that as a result of his experience at the Home Office, he had come to the conclusion that the case for the death penalty was no longer strong enough to justify its retention, and Mr. Brooke thought that abolition should now be given a trial. But Mr. Brooke said that murderers should now be made to serve much longer than the 9 years or so which had applied broadly in the past. Well, now, as the House of Commons proceeds, we present our own debate with 4 protagonists on each side. The arguments will be opened and summed up by 2 members of Parliament who have left the Commons debate to come here. Against abolition, Sir Peter Rawlinson QC, Solicitor General in the Conservative government. For abolition, Mr. Leslie Hale, Labour MP, veteran campaigner against hanging, and one of the co-sponsors of Mr. Silverman's bill. First, Sir Peter Rawlinson, why do you want to keep it?
Well, I think execution, judicial, solemn execution is a terrible thing, and I think any man who has to say that it must be done, it must be a very serious thing for him to do. But I believe that this particular penalty for particular people, namely professional criminals, is the one real deterrent. I think it is the deterrent for the gangster, for the robber with violence. He is a man who weighs the cost, weighs risk against risk, weighs the booty he may get against the penalty he may pay. And I believe that society is entitled to say to that man, if you go and buy your gun and arm yourself with the gun and load it and take it with you and kill, then you yourself will suffer death. I think they are the only people to whom this penalty really can be used as a deterrent. I believe it should be retained, and I think at the present state of crime, some 20,000 more people will suffer violence in the next 12 months since we're all meeting here. I think it should and must be maintained, and I think it is something which I hope the House of Commons this evening is going to see is maintained for these people, the people who know what they're about, who know what they're doing, and who are out to rob and will use violence and will use excessive violence if they think the penalty will be no worse than if they use no violence.
Mr. Leslie Hale, why do you wish to see capital punishment?
This argument about deterrence, of course, is the standard argument that's been put for 150 years in respect of every form of capital punishment and has always been proved wrong. Astonishing that Henry Brooke should bring testimony today to say that he's now convinced that that particular argument cannot be borne out. I approach it from a quite different point of view. I approach it from the point of view of the sanctity of human life. I think we've got to establish standards. I think we've got to respect them. If anyone wants to say let the assassins commence, let me say at once, I prefer us to inculcate an ethical policy and to say that we are not prepared to take away a human life in circumstances which are never absolutely certain, to impose an irrevocable punishment when it's not clear. But I stand by the sanctity of human life, and I agree with Sidney's concluding words. That's
Mr. Silverman.
Yes, that's like this little candle. I was born into a world in which we believed in the perfectibility of man and in the human progress. We've had 2 world wars and we've had all this destruction. We're only saving 2 or 3 lives a year now. It's rather a pragmatic argument, but that's still the ethical argument. Let's light this little candle and see how far it sheds its beams. It's worth trying.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll come back to you later in our discussion.
That's the last thing you'll get. The last thing we want. But I don't think myself that you can show any evidence that there is going to be more danger to the police as a result of abolition than there is now.
May I
just finish
case?
on this? I'd like to say that the real point is whether we're putting life in danger or whether we're taking life. What you do in capital punishment is to take life on the assumption that this is doing some good.
Yes.
I agree with Mr. Hale. It's basically a moral question. But also, it's a question of the danger of mistake. And here, this is, to my mind, the final argument. We are never quite sure that we've got the right person convicted.
May I ask you to... nobody has yet mentioned the question of public opinion and whether it matters if, as is suggested, public opinion is against this change, whereas the House of Commons is in
Yes,
favour.
it's something
I feel
that-
very
Just a moment, Sir John. Mrs. Kelly.
I do feel very strongly that the House of Commons is totally out of touch with public opinion in this. I feel that, in fact, the public feel quite genuinely that we have more consideration for the criminal and not nearly enough for the person who is sinned against.
Well, that's a good
And I do
example of an
feel-
emotional
I do really
argument
feel-
used on this subject.
I do feel quite definitely, I mean, there's this the poll in the Daily Mail today, 67% of the people questioned very strongly that it should be retained. It's not because they're brutal, it's simply because they do feel that the police and prison warders and old people living alone are entitled to this extra protection.
Comment from you, Mr. Hale, on the House
How do you
of
have